Welcome to the Doctrine Deep Dive. Today, we're really embarking on a massive synthesis, I think. We're pulling together some truly foundational texts to try and understand political behavior.
Yeah, and not just behavior, but also the crisis of democratic stability we seem to be seeing in the contemporary world.
Exactly. Our mission today is clarity. We need clarity, but, pursued through a lot of detail. We have to start right at the bedrock, I think.
Party identification.
Party identification, and track how our understanding of that loyalty, that anchor, has evolved from this fixed identity to something maybe more fluid, like a calculation.
Right. And then from there, we absolutely have to tackle that sprawling, often, frankly, confusing debate about polarization.
Yeah.
Is the American public genuinely polarized ideologically?
Or is it something else? Are we just better sorted, as some argue?
Precisely. And then finally, we have to move to the consequences, the really high-stakes consequences of these deep societal divisions. We need to examine what scholars Jennifer McCoy and Murat Somer call pernicious polarization.
Okay, so that framework feels right. Let's ground this. What are the core readings we're drawing on today?
Okay, so for the foundation, for party loyalty, we're leaning really heavily on Richard Johnston's piece, Party Identification. Unmoved mover or sum of preferences. That's key.
And that piece forces us back to the classics, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You can't understand Johnston without understanding the context he's responding to. So, the American voter, elections, and the political order.
Yeah.
Those are the touchstones.
Okay. And for the polarization debate, that feels more contemporary.
It is. So there we're setting up a contrast. On one side, you have Morris Fiorina and Samuel Abrams really championing that sorting thesis.
The idea that Americans haven't become more extreme, just better sorted.
Exactly. And we contrast that with work like Hans Knoll's, looking at elite polarization, how the parties themselves changed. And Alan Abramowitz's work is crucial here, too, looking at the profound demographic shifts.
Race and religion, specifically.
Race, religion, yeah. Those big social changes. And then, as you said, we cap it all off with McCoy and Somer.
Right. They're toward a theory of pernicious polarization and the subversion of democracy. That comparative work feels essential for understanding the stakes. It forces us to see modern political conflict isn't just disagreement. It's something more like existential hostility.
It really is.
Yes.
And I think the initial tension, the thing that kind of sets the stage for everything we're going to talk about, it runs through all these readings, is political identity, this fixed social psychological loyalty, an anchor, like you said, or is it just a readily updated reflection of current political fights and how well the president's doing?
Are we dealing with deep-seated identities or just seeing the chaos of modern politics reflected back at us in the survey data?
That's the fundamental question we need to wrestle with.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting right at the foundation. Party identification, or PID. To really get the debate, we have to start with the original view, the canonical view.
Right.
Walk us through the Michigan School's revolutionary idea of party identification as the unmoved mover.
Okay. So the canonical view, really solidified by scholars at the University of Michigan, back in the mid-20th century, it characterized party identification very differently than just, say, a policy preference.
It wasn't about issues.
Not primarily.
No.
It was seen as a simple, enduring loyalty. Think of it as fundamentally social psychological. It's something learned early, almost always within the family.
Like inheriting your dad's favorite sports team.
That's a common analogy, yeah. Or maybe like a cultural tradition, or even, an accent. It's absorbed more than chosen initially.
So it's not really rational in the sense of sitting down and comparing party platforms when you're like 15.
Exactly. It happens long before a young person can really grasp the nuances of, say, marginal tax rates versus Social Security reform.
Right.
And because of this sort of pre-political character, how adolescents get socialized into partisanship, the initial loyalty often contains, and this is a direct quote, little or no policy content. Yeah. And that explains why the Michigan School put such a strong emphasis on its resistance to change. They argued party identification becomes almost an intrinsic part of the self.
Like a filter.
It operates almost like a cognitive screen,
Yeah.
filtering information. And this screen, they believed, was so sturdy, they claimed only an event of extraordinary intensity.
Like the Great Depression
or
the Civil War.
Exactly. Something truly profound that shakes the foundations of society. Only that could shake a significant part of the electorate enough to establish new, lasting political loyalties. That's what they called a realignment.
That makes the concept incredibly powerful for political science, then. Because if this identification is inherently sticky, inherently resistant to change, then any observed movement, any shift in the aggregate numbers becomes historically significant. It signals a real change in the political bedrock of the nation, not just temporary fluctuations.
Absolutely. And the fixity of this concept, that's what allowed these early scholars to even define something called a normal vote.
Okay, what's the normal vote?
They could essentially predict what the vote distribution should look like in any given election, based purely on the existing levels of party identification in the population.
Just based on how many Democrats and Republicans there were.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And then the actual election outcomes, which are always affected by, specific candidates, current events, scandals, whatever those outcomes, could be interpreted as mere departures from that normal prediction.
So it gave scholars a stable baseline.
Exactly. A baseline against which they could measure all those ephemeral political forces, the short-term stuff.
And maybe the most crucial insight here, as Johnston's review really emphasizes, is that the party itself becomes an object of affection. It's not just a vehicle for ideas.
Precisely. That's a key distinction. The party is an object in its own right. And the claim that party identification actually moves other cognitive features, well, that claim is remarkably robust, even today.
So it's a causal claim. My party ID causes me to prefer certain policies.
That's the argument. Party identification acts as this perpetual filter that helps determine your issue preferences, how you perceive candidates, even the way you link candidates to those issues.
So this Democrat says A and the Republican says B.
Your initial loyalty often dictates which side of the issue you perceive as correct, or maybe even which side you pay attention to. It shapes your political reality.
Wow. Okay, that's a powerful model, very stable. But almost immediately, it was vulnerable to challenge, right? Especially from perspectives emphasizing voter rationality.
Oh, definitely.
What's the major alternative view? The one that sees party identification not as an anchor, but as a, quote, readily updated sum of preferences.
Right. This challenge, often associated with the rational choice school of thought, essentially tries to strip party identification of that special social psychological status.
Take away its magic.
Kind of. If party ID is simply a running tally, a sum of preferences, then it's changing all the time based on new information. And if it's always changing,
then it loses its ability to be that stable anchor for the political world. It's just reflecting the waves, not holding the ship steady.
Exactly. It drains the concept of its original significance.
Now, the rational choice perspective, and Morris Fiorina articulated this very clearly, models party identification as a Bayesian prior. Okay, that's technical language. Can you unpack that conversationally? What does it mean for PID to be a running sum or a Bayesian prior?
Yeah, let's try. Think of it like a continually updating mental average, or maybe like keeping score.
Okay.
Every piece of political information, you get a good economic report, a presidential scandal, a policy you like, a policy you hate, it gets processed and added to your running tally for each party.
So my current party ID is just the total score at this moment.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
It's the summation of all those positive and negative considerations you've encountered up to today. It's not some deep emotional loyalty forged in childhood. It's more like a sophisticated, continuously calculated summary judgment about which party has, on balance, been better for you or the country recently.
Okay, so we went from rooting for a sports team, because your dad did, to something more like constantly updating your stock portfolio based on market news.
It's a pretty good analogy, actually.
Yeah, but that implies identification must be highly susceptible to movement, right? Even in the short term.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
It suggests that our identifications aren't fixed anchors, but are susceptible to constant movement. Specifically, they talk about displacement of intensity in the short run. Meaning, if the party in power messes up the economy, my previously strong Democratic identification might weaken almost immediately. I might become a weak Democrat or even lean independent for a while.
And the most famous empirical sort of support for this rational choice view is the concept of macropartisanship.
Exactly. Macropartisanship is the theory that argues that party identification, when you aggregate it across the whole population, is continuously updated. It moves up and down in response to short-term conditions.
Like the economy or presidential approval ratings.
Precisely. So, if the president is popular and the economy is good, the president's party tends to see its share of identifiers tick up in the polls. If things go bad, it ticks down. The aggregate line of partisanship looks highly responsive, almost like it's in constant flux.
Okay, so the big debate really hinges on whether those movements we see in macropartisanship are just temporary displacements of intensity,
Hmm.
or if they represent something deeper, maybe even the beginnings of a fundamental realignment, like the Michigan school talked about. It's tricky.
It is tricky. And Johnston's review reminds us that even the very early scholars noticed this ambiguity, which brings us to the Columbia School, who actually came before Michigan.
Right, Lazarsfeld and his colleagues, what was their take?
Well, it's a crucial historical nuance. While the Michigan group really emphasized individual stability that fixed loyalty,
Hmm.
the Columbia scholars looking at panel data in the 1940s actually observed a great deal of individual instability. Their data showed lots of people changing their minds during a campaign, or even between elections.
So people were flipping back and forth.
Some were, yes. But here's the interesting part. Despite that individual churn, they focused on the aggregate stability of the electorate. When you zoomed out, the overall balance between Democrats and Republicans looked pretty solid.
Wait, how does that work? How can individual instability lead to aggregate stability?
Their emphasis was more sociological, kind of Durkheimian. They argued aggregate stability doesn't require every single person to stick to their initial preference forever.
Okay.
What matters is a stable pattern of flow between the alternatives. So imagine 100 voters leave the Democratic Party in one election cycle.
Hmm.
But at the same time, 100 different voters switch to the Democratic Party. The individual movement is massive, but the net effect on the aggregate balance is zero. It stays the same.
Ah, okay. So the political landscape is like this churning ocean that, if you look at it from a great distance, maybe looks perfectly flat, even though underneath the surface there's constant motion.
That's a great way to put it. And this nuance, this observation from the Columbia School, it already suggests that political behavior is maybe more dynamic than the simple unmoved mover idea implies. Even if the end result, a stable partisan balance, looks the same on the surface.
That sets us up perfectly then for the contemporary polarization debate.
Hmm.
Because the whole argument over whether Americans are genuinely ideologically polarized or just, sorted, it's really a debate about whether we're seeing fundamental aggregate movement towards the extremes
Hmm.
or just a new pattern of flow like the Columbia folks saw that maybe looks extreme from the outside. This is where it gets really interesting. The better sorted thesis, championed by Morris Fiorina and Samuel Abrams.
Yeah, Fiorina and Abrams, they explicitly challenge that widespread narrative, the one you hear all the time, that Americans have become increasingly polarized.
The idea that everyone's rushing to the left or right wing, leaving the center empty.
Exactly. They argue that narrative basically misinterprets consistency for extremity. They say we're not necessarily more extreme, just more consistent.
And they back this up with some pretty compelling historical data, don't they? They claim the overall distribution of American partisanship hasn't really changed that much since the mid-1960s.
That's their central empirical point.
Yeah.
They argue it's been remarkably constant, specifically since that big realignment following Lyndon Johnson's 1964 election solidified the modern party system.
And critically, they point out there hasn't been a persistent decrease in the proportion of people calling themselves independents.
Right. The share of independents goes up and down a bit, but there's no long-term trend of them disappearing. And, maybe even more importantly, if you look at ideological self-identification, when surveys ask people, are you liberal, moderate, or conservative?
Yeah.
The distribution there has also been pretty stable since the early 1970s when those questions started being asked regularly. Moderates remain the modal category.
Modal meaning the most common response.
The most common response, yes. The great ideological center of the American public, according to Fiorina and Abrams, hasn't actually vanished. It's still there.
Okay, so if the country as a whole hasn't really moved to the extremes, why does it feel so polarized? Why does it feel like we're tearing ourselves apart? They propose this mechanism of sorting.
Sorting, right? Sorting basically means that the political identities of individuals are becoming more internally consistent, more congruent.
Yeah.
Meaning that people who call themselves Democrats are now reliably liberal on most issues, and people who call themselves Republicans are now reliably conservative on most issues.
Whereas before, it was messier.
Much messier. 50 years ago, you had plenty of conservative Democrats, especially in the South, and liberal Republicans, particularly in the Northeast. Those types of voters have largely sorted themselves out. They've moved to the party that better matches their overall ideological profile.
Okay, this is a really critical distinction for you, the listener, to grasp. It's not necessarily that I, as an individual voter, suddenly became a hardline extremist on 5 different issues. It's more that my party identification, Democrat or Republican, finally lines up neatly with my pre-existing positions on those issues. Which maybe wasn't true back in the day of the conservative Southern Democrat or the liberal Rockefeller Republican.
That is the core distinction Thurene and Abrams are making. And it's why they argue the appearance of ideological polarization in the mass public is often, quote, a misleading appearance.
Because we're looking at the alignment, not the actual extremity of views.
Exactly. When you look at the raw data, the distribution of opinions on individual issues might not have shifted that drastically for the average person. But because those opinions now cluster much more neatly within each party, it looks like polarization. Their conclusion remains: the country as a whole is no more polarized than it was a generation ago. We are better aligned, better sorted, but not necessarily more ideologically extreme in our personal beliefs.
This feeds directly into that crucial insight about the dichotomous trap, a concept Yphtach Lelkes elaborates on. The idea that how we ask questions in surveys might be exaggerating the appearance of polarization.
Yes, that's a really important methodological point. Think about how issues are often presented in classic survey work, like the American National Election Studies.
The 7-point scales.
Often, yeah.
Yeah.
You're asked to place yourself on a scale between two opposing poles, like favor military strength on one end versus favor diplomacy on the other, or between black people are responsible for their own condition versus racial discrimination is responsible.
Right, you have to pick a spot between 1 and 7.
And these scales are designed to measure alignment, to see which direction people lean. But they can often hide the complexity, the nuance, the moderation in actual public opinion.
Because the reality is most people probably don't fall 100% on one side of a complex issue like that, right? They hold cross-cutting views.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Lux gives a good example. He talks about a hypothetical moderate Democrat. This person might strongly believe, say 90%, that poor people need generous help in government intervention. But maybe they also worry a little bit, say 10%, about the potential incentive effects of welfare programs or the size of government spending. They hold both concerns, maybe in different proportions. They have nuanced, fundamentally moderate views.
But the way the survey scale works, if that person consistently leans liberal, even if it's just 60-40 or 70-30 on most of those 7-point scales,
Right.
their overall score, when you average across all the issues, will end up reflecting a liberal position on the final ideological scale that researchers construct.
And this is the punchline that really challenges the simple claim of mass extremity. My high score on that final scale, Lux argues, reflects the consistency of me taking liberal positions across a whole range of different issues.
Not necessarily the extremity of my position on any single one of those issues.
Exactly. That person who scores as liberal on the scale is simply consistently aligning with the typical Democratic Party stance across most of the surveyed items. But they don't necessarily hold radical, uncompromising views on any of them. The score doesn't justify calling them an extreme leftist who wants to, abolish all markets.
It just means they're well sorted into the Democratic coalition's general viewpoint.
Precisely. They fit the profile consistently.
Okay, this sorting concept provides really crucial clarity, I think. It helps explain why Washington seems so deadlocked and polarized, even if most Americans might still occupy a broad middle ground.
Because that middle ground is now forced to choose between two highly consistent, highly polarized elite teams.
Right. Which leads us directly to the next big question. Why did this sorting happen? What were the big forces, the tectonic plates moving beneath the surface that drove this alignment? We need to look at ideology, race, and religion.
Well, if the mass public sorted itself, the parties first had to provide clearer categories to sort into, right? The teams needed distinct jerseys.
Makes sense.
And Hunsnell argues pretty persuasively that this sorting process is fundamentally driven by ideological activists and political elites. They're the ones who constructed the increasingly polarized parties we see today.
So elite polarization came first.
Largely, yes. Noel's work suggests that the ideological distance between Democrats and Republicans in Congress started widening significantly before we saw the mass public sorting phenomenon really take off.
So starting maybe in the 1970s and 80s, activists within the parties, interest groups, they pushed the parties to become more ideologically distinct.
That's the argument. They defined the teams more clearly. And then the public, through a process almost like self-selection, began to gravitate towards the team that already aligned better with their existing, maybe loosely held philosophical views.
So people who already leaned liberal started saying, okay, the Democrats are clearly my team now. And conservatives said, yep, the Republicans are definitely where I belong.
Precisely. This was a really critical step in turning what might have been diffuse ideological leanings into concrete partisan attachments. It facilitated the sorting process without necessarily requiring the average citizen to suddenly become more extreme in their personal views.
But this sorting wasn't just happening in an abstract ideological vacuum, was it? Alan Abramowitz brings in the massive demographic and social shifts that were fundamentally altering the composition of the party coalitions at the same time.
Absolutely critical point. We have to factor in the dramatic increase in racial and ethnic diversity in the United States.
Driven by large-scale immigration, especially from Latin America and Asia.
Right. And also combined with different fertility rates among different groups. These forces have profoundly reshaped the American electorate since the 1960s.
And how did that impact the parties?
Well, the non-white share of eligible voters has consistently grown. And because of existing partisan loyalties, often linked back to the civil rights era and ongoing issues of minority rights, this demographic shift has overwhelmingly strengthened the Democratic coalition. Non-white voters lean heavily Democratic. As their numbers grew, the Democratic base changed. And as a result, the racial divide between the Democratic and Republican electoral coalitions has, quote, widened dramatically.
Abramowitz gives a really striking data point on this. The non-white share of Democratic voters, it increased from what, about 16% in 1996?
Yeah, already significant.
Or a staggering 34%, over a third, by 2012.
Think about that. That's a fundamental restructuring of a major party's core constituency in less than 2 decades. It's huge.
And we have to look at the other side of the coin, too, right? The reciprocal shift, what was happening with white voters, particularly concerning religion and culture.
Right. Well, the Democrats were becoming more diverse. A major factor driving white voters towards the Republican Party, especially working-class white voters, was religion and sort of cultural identity.
This is complex, though.
It is. But generally, voters who are more religiously observant, particularly white voters, have increasingly become reliable Republican voters. And this holds true even for those with lower family incomes, say under $60,000 a year, who might, on purely economic grounds, seem like they should lean Democratic.
That really is counterintuitive from a traditional class-based view of politics, isn't it? The idea that a lower-income worker, who historically might have been a solid Democrat based on economic self-interest, now finds their religious beliefs or cultural orientation pulling them much more strongly towards the Republican Party.
It completely upends the old New Deal coalition alignment, where class was a much stronger predictor. This cultural realignment means that for a very large segment of the white electorate, particularly those without college degrees, their religious identity, their sense of cultural status, maybe their moral views, these things often trump purely economic considerations in determining their partisan loyalty.
So the Republican coalition has really consolidated its support among religious conservatives and also among many working-class whites who perhaps feel culturally alienated or displaced by social changes.
That seems to be a major part of this story, yes.
So the big takeaway here, pulling these threads together, these combined shifts, the ideological sorting driven by elites, the demographic diversification strengthening Democrats, and the religious and cultural sorting pulling many white voters toward the Republicans.
Yeah.
They've made the Democratic and Republican electoral coalitions today far more distinctive, far more different from each other in terms of their basic social characteristics and their political orientations than they have been at any time in probably the last 60 years.
That's exactly right. You used to have significant overlap, issues and identities used to cross-cut the partisan divide. You know, union members who were socially conservative, affluent voters who were pro-environment. That allowed for more overlap, more potential for compromise. Now, things like ideology, race, and religious belief largely reinforce the partisan divide. They all line up. It creates two increasingly separate social and cultural teams with less and less common ground between them.
Okay, so what does this all mean? If the mass public is mostly sorted, maybe not drastically more extreme ideologically, but sorted into these distinct teams, we have to address the consequence of this deep sorting. Which brings us to pernicious polarization, as defined by Jennifer McCoy and Murat Somer. This moves beyond just survey responses, right? This is about health of democracy itself.
This is absolutely where the stakes become existential for democratic governance. Pernicious polarization, as they define it, isn't just about ideological distance on a 7-point scale. It's what happens when multiple divisions in society, political, economic, cultural, racial, religious, all kind of collapse onto each other.
They all line up.
They collapse into one single dominant cleavage or boundary line. It becomes a simple, stark us versus them. The division becomes totalizing. It starts to define not just your political choices, but your whole social life.
And this collapse, it extends beyond politics into what scholars call affective polarization. Can you explain that dynamic for the listener? What's affective polarization?
Affective polarization is really the emotional, the social manifestation of this deep use versus them division. It's characterized by intense distrust, suspicion, fear, even visceral dislike or hatred.
Towards the other side.
Towards people on the other side, yeah. And it extends from the purely political world into everyday social relations. We see evidence of people actively segregating themselves in their neighborhoods, in their friendships, certainly in their news consumption habits.
Creating echo chambers.
Creating echo chambers, reducing the chances for any kind of cross-cutting interaction or conversation, and generating these reinforcing cycles of mutual hostility and misunderstanding.
And the public discourse that emerges in this environment, McCoy and Somer describe it as Manichaean. What does that mean?
Manichaean means it's highly moralizing. It simplifies the entire complex world into a battle between absolute good and absolute evil.
No shades of gray.
Zero shades of gray. The in-group, S, is described as inherently good, patriotic, virtuous, maybe the real Americans. While the out-group, them, is cast as fundamentally evil, corrupt, immoral, unpatriotic, maybe even an existential threat to the nation itself.
Wow. And this dynamic, this moralizing, it fuels something called negative partisanship.
Exactly. Negative partisanship is when voters are motivated primarily by their intense dislike, fear, or hatred of the opposing party and its candidates, often much more strongly than any genuine liking or enthusiasm for their own side.
So you vote against the other guy more than you vote for your guy.
That's a huge part of it in highly polarized settings, yes. The primary motivation is stopping the evil other side.
This sounds like a political environment where the center just cannot hold. If the whole field becomes this dichotomized, moralized battle, what happens to people who are actually moderate? Or people trying to build bridges?
They essentially drop out or are silenced. People who hold moderate views or maybe cross-cutting opinions on different issues, they find themselves increasingly marginalized, even ostracized within their own side.
No room for dissent within the tribe.
Pretty much. And bridge makers, people who attempt dialogue or compromise across the divide, they're often swiftly labeled as traitors or sellouts by the most committed partisans on their own side. The system actively punishes cooperation and rewards conflict and purity.
And this kind of polarization is particularly dangerous because it seems to become self-propagating, right? Hard to reverse.
Absolutely. That's a key finding. Once political elites start successfully using these polarizing Manichaean tactics because maybe it helps them win an election or consolidate power, it triggers these deeper dynamics that can, as McCoy and Somer put it, perversely transform the party itself and the mainstream political field at large. Elites get locked into these anti-democratic or highly confrontational postures because moderation is seen as weakness by their base. Only purity and extreme conflict get rewarded, so the cycle reinforces itself.
Now, McCoy and Somer stress that this really dangerous, pernicious polarization isn't simply explained by just having existing cleavages in society. They give examples like Zimbabwe had deep ethnic divisions, but that didn't always lead to this kind of intense political polarization.
Right.
Whereas other countries like Poland or Hungary, which are relatively homogenous ethnically, still experienced intense political polarization. So what's the key ingredient?
The key ingredient, they argue, is the role of political actors. Polarization arises when polarizing political entrepreneurs exploit existing grievances with us versus them discourse.
So you need the underlying fault lines, the grievances.
You need the raw material, yes.
Yeah.
The existing cleavages, the sources of discontent. But it's the political entrepreneurs, the leaders, who act as the architects. They're the ones who build the walls, who frame the conflict in these stark, irreconcilable terms.
And this brings us to maybe the most powerful and potentially most dangerous concept in their theory, the idea of formative rifts. What are these, and why are they so much more dangerous than, say, arguing about the federal budget deficit?
Formative rifts. These are the really deep cuts. They're long-standing, often unresolved disputes that go back to the very formation of the nation-state itself.
Disputes about what?
Disputes over fundamental national identity. Who counts as a real citizen? What is the basic character or purpose of the nation? What should the relationship be between different foundational groups like ethnic or religious communities, or between the state and religion? These are often conflicts that emerged during the nation's founding period, but were never fully resolved.
Okay, so give us an example. In the United States context.
In the United States, the most obvious and enduring formative rift is clearly the dispute over race, slavery, and citizenship rights, going all the way back to the founding of the Civil War. and continuing through the civil rights movement and arguably up to today.
And maybe in Turkey, another case they look at.
In Turkey, a key formative rift is often identified as the deep center-periphery conflict between the secular, modernizing urban elite established by Ataturk and the more religious, conservative, rural, and provincial majority.
Okay. And why are conflicts based on these formative rifts hypothesized to be so much more enduring and pernicious?
Because they're existential. They aren't just differences over policy preferences, which you can potentially compromise on. They are fundamental disagreements over who we are as a nation, who belongs, and what the nation means.
The stakes are ultimate.
The stakes become ultimate. When a political entrepreneur successfully frames a contemporary conflict as being fundamentally about one of these deep historical formative rifts, it automatically raises the stakes to an absolute level. It justifies almost any action, including anti-democratic behavior, because the opponent isn't just wrong on policy, they're portrayed as an enemy of the nation's fundamental identity, a threat to its very existence.
Wow. Okay. And McCoy and Somer identify 3 primary types of grievances that these polarizing entrepreneurs commonly exploit to kind of activate and weaponize these formative rifts. Let's walk through them. First, the political grievance.
Okay, the political grievance. This is typically framed as a crisis of representation, a feeling among significant parts of the population that they are unrepresented, ignored, or even betrayed by the existing political establishment.
Like the elites are corrupt or out of touch.
Exactly. They feel that traditional parties are colluding, maybe unresponsive technocrats run everything, and the whole system is rigged against ordinary people. A classic example they might point to is Hugo Chávez's initial rise in Venezuela.
How so?
He successfully exploited widespread public disgust with the traditional political parties, which were widely blamed for corruption and seen as completely unresponsive to the needs of the poor majority. His populist discourse basically targeted the entire existing political class as illegitimate.
Okay, that's the political grievance. Second is the economic grievance. This sounds more familiar, maybe. Revolving around inequality, stagnation.
Yes, but it's often more than just a temporary recession. It usually taps into longer-term feelings of economic insecurity, income inequality, and especially what they call relative deprivation of left behinds.
Meaning people feel they're falling behind compared to others.
Exactly. It's not just about being poor in absolute terms, but feeling that your group, your community, is losing ground economically and socially compared to other groups, often perceived as elites or outsiders who are unfairly benefiting.
Can you give an example here?
The rise of the Law and Justice Party, PIS, in Poland is a powerful illustration they might use. PI successfully mobilized many voters, particularly outside the major cities, by emphasizing an ideology of Polish solidarism against perceived cosmopolitan liberalism. They highlighted the sense of decline in the economic status and, just as importantly, the social esteem of traditional Catholic Polish workers relative to the urban liberal elites who were seen as benefiting most from globalization and EU integration.
So it's not just about money, it's about status and respect, too.
Very much so. The grievance is often deeply tied to a perceived loss of status for one's group.
Okay. And finally, the third type, the cultural grievance. This often feels like the most intractable because it touches on core values and identity.
Yeah, these are often the toughest ones to find political compromise on. They revolved around moral issues, clashes between secular and religious worldviews, differing lifestyles, maybe conflicts over church-state relations, or battles over gender roles and sexual rights.
And crucially, this cultural grievance can also stem from a dominant group feeling its status is threatened.
Yes, that's a key dynamic observed in several cases. It can emerge from a perceived loss of social and cultural status by a historically dominant group. We see this reflected, for instance, in the reaction of certain segments of white Christian voters in the United States to growing demographic diversity, changing social norms, and the perceived erosion of their historical, cultural, and electoral dominance.
So these polarizing entrepreneurs take these political, economic, and cultural grievances,
Right.
and they skillfully bundle them together, linking them all back to that deep underlying formative rift, creating that single all-encompassing us versus them boundary line.
That's the dangerous alchemy they perform. They weave all these threads of discontent into one narrative where the other side is responsible for all the problems and represents a fundamental threat.
Okay, connecting this back to the bigger picture. The major consequence of this pernicious polarization is democratic backsliding or erosion. What are the specific institutional consequences that McCoy and Somer outline? How does this polarization actually damage democratic institutions?
Well, They find a direct association. Pernicious polarization is strongly linked with significant democratic erosion, which you can measure objectively using things like the VDem Institute's Liberal Democracy Index scores, which show declines in countries experiencing this phenomenon.
But how does it happen? What are the mechanisms?
The key institutional facilitators for this erosion, they argue, are often found in the electoral system and the structure of executive power. Specifically, majoritarian electoral systems think first past the post, like in the US or UK.
Winner take all.
Winner take all, exactly. Or even some proportional representation systems that give seat bonuses to the largest party. When these are combined with already strong executive powers,
Like a powerful presidency.
like a powerful presidency with limited checks and balances, yes. This combination creates very strong incentives for whichever party manages to gain a majority, even a slim one, in that highly polarized environment.
Incentives to do what?
Incentives to amass sufficient power to change the rules of the political game itself. The goal shifts. It's no longer just about winning the next election under the existing rules.
It becomes about rigging the rules for the future.
Precisely. It becomes about cementing your party's electoral advantage indefinitely, perhaps even making it impossible for the opposition to ever win again. We see this manifested in actions like aggressive partisan gerrymandering.
Drawing electoral maps to guarantee outcomes.
Right. Or stacking the judiciary, especially high courts, with loyalists who will uphold the party's actions. Or even pushing through constitutional reforms specifically designed to enhance executive power further and weaken legislative or judicial checks and balances.
Actions we've definitely seen examples of in places like Hungary or Turkey recently.
Absolutely. Those are key cases they examine. And the justification in this Manichaean environment is that the opposition is so dangerous, so illegitimate, so evil, that using potentially anti-democratic means to sideline them permanently is actually seen as necessary, even patriotic, by the ruling party's supporters.
Okay, this leads directly into their framework for trying to predict the likely outcomes of pernicious polarization based on two key factors: the nature of the rift, formative or contemporary, and the balance of electoral capacity between the opposing camps. Let's break down the prediction for a country like the United States based on their model.
Okay, so for the United States, first, the polarization is clearly centered around a deep formative rift race, identity, citizenship. We've established that. Second, despite the intensity, there's still arguably a rough balance of electoral capacity, meaning both the Democrats and Republicans have significant mobilization capabilities. Both sides can win national elections, even if it's by narrow margins. The outcome isn't predetermined electorally.
So given a formative rift and a rough balance of power, what's the predicted outcome?
The predicted outcome, according to their framework, is enduring symmetrical polarization with democratic erosion.
Okay, unpack. Enduring symmetrical polarization with democratic erosion.
Enduring means it's likely to persist for a long time because the formative rift makes compromise incredibly difficult. Symmetrical suggests that both sides are likely engaging in escalating polarizing rhetoric and increasingly in strategic, norm-breaking, or even anti-democratic tactics to gain advantage.
So both sides start bending or breaking the rules.
That's the danger in a symmetrical scenario, yes. And the result is democratic erosion, a gradual decline in the quality of democracy, characterized by things like increased gridlock, loss of trust in institutions, challenges to electoral legitimacy, and the weakening of checks and balances, but probably stopping short of full authoritarian collapse because neither side can fully vanquish the other due to the balance of power.
So it's like a persistent high-fever political stalemate where the system itself gets sicker and sicker, but doesn't necessarily die immediately.
That's a pretty grim but potentially accurate description of that predicted outcome. Now, contrast that with a situation where the balance of power is imbalanced.
Meaning one side is clearly much stronger electorally than the other?
Yes, or the opposition has lost, or maybe never had, the capacity to effectively challenge the incumbent through elections.
Yeah.
In those cases, the opposition often turns to other means relying on institutional power bases they might still hold.
Like the courts, or the bureaucracy, or maybe even the military in some countries.
Exactly. They try to use these non-electoral levers to challenge or constrain the dominant incumbent.
And if those institutional challenges fail, if the dominant party manages to consolidate control despite them,
Then the predicted outcome is potentially more volatile. They label it careening, or old elites return extra-constitutionally, meaning the system might swing wildly between periods of unchecked populist dominance careening towards authoritarianism and moments where elements of the old establishment or institutional power centers, like the military, intervene outside the normal constitutional process to push back. We've seen cycles like this arguably in places like Thailand or the Philippines at various points, where stable democratic norms just can't seem to take root because the underlying power structure is so volatile and tilted.
And they also have a scenario where there is a rough balance of power, like the U.S., but the polarization is mainly around contemporary issues, maybe economic policy or social issues that aren't tied to a deep formative rift. What happens then?
In that case, the outcome is predicted to be more indeterminate. The polarization might still be very high, potentially leading to instability or gridlock. But because the fundamental stakes aren't perceived as quite so existential.
Because it's not about who we are.
Right. Because it's not directly tied to that irreconcilable formative rift, there's a greater theoretical possibility for eventual compromise, deal-making, or maybe just shifts in political coalitions over time. They point to examples like early periods in Venezuela or Greece fitting this pattern, where intense conflict existed, but wasn't necessarily locked into an inescapable identity battle.
So the key really is that formative rift. It makes the conflict feel irreconcilable. When the fight is fundamentally over who belongs in the nation, you can't just split the difference on policy.
Exactly. Compromise becomes almost impossible, even treasonous, in that context.
Okay, this leaves us with the really grim final challenge that McCoy and Somer highlight: the sheer difficulty of depolarization. Once a country is stuck in this pernicious cycle, how do you get out? It seems like the path forward for those who oppose the polarizing entrepreneurs is just a minefield.
It's an incredibly difficult dilemma, maybe the core strategic challenge. Opponents, whether they're a mainstream party or civil society groups, face this terrible choice.
What's the choice?
Do they try to fight fire with fire? Do they reciprocate the polarizing tactics, the Manichaean rhetoric, the norm-breaking? Sometimes that might feel necessary just to survive politically or to mobilize their own base.
But the risk is?
The risk is that just accelerates the downward spiral. It further erodes democratic norms, deepens the U.S. versus them divide, and validates the very tactics they claim to oppose. It pours gasoline on the fire.
Okay, so what's the alternative? Try to depolarize.
The alternative is to try to depolarize, to stick to principles of moderation, dialogue, bridge building, focusing on policy and common ground.
But what's the risk there?
The risk there, which is often realized, is fragmentation and political weakness. In a highly polarized environment, moderation is often punished by your own base, who demand hardline opposition and see compromise as betrayal. The depolarizing message might not resonate, and the party or movement trying it might simply lose elections or fade into irrelevance.
So successful depolarization efforts must be extremely rare based on their analysis.
They are depressingly rare in the cases they studied in depth. It's very hard to pull off.
What strategies might possibly work, if any?
Well, they suggest that strategies have to focus not just on appealing rhetoric, but on building successful electoral strategies first. You have to be able to win power. This might involve internal party reforms to foster more pluralism within the opposition coalition, and finding ways to provide genuine political representation options that can actually appeal across some of those hardened cleavages, maybe by focusing on shared economic concerns or local issues.
But the sheer difficulty of trying to pursue depolarization while you're facing an opponent using Manichaean existential rhetoric,
Yeah.
it's immense. It requires a kind of political courage and strategic patience that often gets punished in today's media and political environment.
It really does. It's perhaps the central challenge facing democracies caught in this trap.
Okay, that brings us towards the end of this really deep dive today. We started right at the beginning with the foundational concept of party identification as this fixed loyalty, the unmoved mover, whose stability was so central to that classic understanding of elections and political change from the Michigan school.
Right, that anchor in the storm.
Then we saw how the contemporary debate shifted focus. The argument became less about whether the mass public was becoming ideologically extreme and more about this idea of political sorting.
Where partisan identity and ideology now align much more consistently, creating these distinct teams even if individual views haven't necessarily radicalized across the board.
Fueled by elite polarization and deep demographic and cultural shifts. And then finally, we explored how this deep sorting, when it gets weaponized by political entrepreneurs, exploiting those historical formative rifts and tapping into existential grievances.
It transforms into something far more dangerous. Pernicious polarization. That totalizing us versus them conflict that really corrodes democratic norms from the inside out.
Fueling effective hostility, that gut-level dislike, and incentivizing political parties to start rewriting the institutional rules of the game to lock in their dominance and eliminate the perceived threat of the opposition.
A very sobering picture.
It is. And we've established pretty clearly, I think, that this polarization isn't just about disagreements over the top marginal tax rate or infrastructure spending anymore. It's fundamentally about attachment to the party as a deep social identity, a team that's increasingly based on these profound cultural, racial, and even religious cleavages.
Which brings us, I think, to a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener, to really chew on after absorbing all this. Especially considering, as we discussed, the origins of partisan loyalty often forming early in life, in those formative years, and how it's now being powerfully reinforced by these deep social identity cleavages.
Yeah.
Given how deeply rooted this effective hostility, this us versus them feeling seems to be in these racial, religious, and cultural identities.
Yeah.
How realistic is it really to expect electoral strategies that focus solely on technocratic policy solutions? You know, things like promising to fix the tax code or improve infrastructure or tweak healthcare policy. How realistic is it to think those kinds of appeals can actually reverse the deep-seated, almost visceral, effective hostility and identity politics that we now observe driving conflict in so many highly polarized democracies?
Can policy arguments overcome identity warfare?
That, I think, is the core challenge facing anyone hoping to depolarize and strengthen democracy today. Something to definitely keep thinking about.